The following is a presentation of the 2021 DeafBlind Symposium, presented by Texas School for the Blind and Visually Impaired in Austin, Texas.
Hello, and welcome to this presentation in the symposium, Deaf-Blind Travelers, Street Crossing, and Communicating with the Uninitiated Public. I'd like to start just letting you know who your presenter is today. That's me. And then we'll talk about where we're going today as well. I'm Dr. Gene Wolfman, and I'm a Certified Orientation and Mobility Specialist, or a COMS, C-O-M-S. I've also held certifications as a low vision therapist and 2 certifications in the field of sign language interpreting. I worked for about 3 decades at the Helen Keller National Center in suburban New York. It is the National Deaf-Blind Center for Youth and Adults. And there I held various job titles, everything from volunteer to director of community services. I've had the good fortune to live here in New York City, and we're recording here today in New York. You may hear some sounds from the outside. I can hear the subways as they pass by. So I apologize if that interferes with the presentation at all. And I also live some of my time in my home in northern Thailand, where I work at a school for the blind and visit elephants. In any case, what are we doing here today, and where are we going with this? Well, first of all, who is this presentation for? I think this presentation is for a number of groups of folks, knowing that today's audience is very varied. Everyone from deaf-blind people and deaf-blind travelers to families and parents and caretakers, as well as professionals and paraprofessionals working with deaf-blind people. So, every section may not be of the most interest to you, but hopefully as a whole, it will give you a good introduction to how we affect reliable, dependable, and secure travel in the community with deaf-blind people, specifically on this topic of interacting with the uninitiated public. I will be including some history as well as research. We don't have a lot of research in this field in general, but we do have documents and some qualitative and quantitative studies that go directly to the issue of communicating with the uninitiated public. And I'll share those with you, showing how we draw out some basic principles that we then apply to the hermeneutics, the functional practices for designing strategies and approaches, as well as the accompanying tools to facilitate communication. I want to take a step back in time to begin. We have some information about deaf-blind people and travel going back all the way to the beginning of the 20th century, as early as 1914. But even decades later, even in 1979, only a couple of years after the National Center on Deaf-Blindness opened, people had a perception that deaf-blind people were not really going to be traveling effectively or regularly in the public. This is a book which I collected when I was doing my dissertation. I actually had the opportunity to speak to them. It was the first published book on deaf-blind O&M called Orientation and Mobility Training for the Deaf-Blind. And Richard worked at a school, and he worked with 2 deaf-blind children. And he made what I think were probably common assumptions in his day. This is what he said. He said, every second that a deaf-blind child moves, he may encounter a mobility problem. And then he went on to assert that very few deafblind persons are going to be traveling independently in a business area, crossing busy streets in a safe manner, and interacting with the sighted public. Well, it's my hope that by the end of this hour, you are at least a little bit challenging those assumptions about travel and deafblind people and their ability to have rich and full lives that include community travel. Thanks. I'm going to be showing you a video now. I hope you'll mindfully attend to it so you'll get some idea of some of the things we're talking about. One of the longer sections of this collage will be a young lady, Gabby, who'll be traveling from her home in New York City, actually from her worksite to her home. And you'll see how she gets about. And after we're done with the video, we'll come back and we'll start exploring seriously the topic of the day. Thanks, enjoy the video, and we'll be back in just a little bit.
Okay, thanks.
Absolutely terrific morning. We've taken a rainy, ugly Wednesday and a Thursday, I think 4 day weekend. I'm so excited. And we turned it into a great celebration. There was a
No.
Which category is that?
No.
Yes, I'm a regular caller, and the
Oh, this is a pickup store.
the program is
We can.
the issue that the gentleman brought up before on the articles in the newspaper that are not addressed. This issue of the slush fund was addressed in the newspaper as far back as I can remember in March of this year, where the slush fund was at $43 billion, and then by Friday, May 21st, in the Philadelphia fire, the money had moved to $50.5 billion.
No.
I am higher than that now, and I find that WCDF does not have a very good record for following stories that of this type. As a matter of fact, the SNL crisis is looming large over our heads right now, and I don't hear the WCDF talk.
So welcome back from our little popcorn break with videos. Let's go through what you actually saw on the videos during those sessions. There were 5 videos. The first was a person who needed to get the track number for the next departing train, and what he used was what we call a force choice designed communication card. The second person was somebody catching a car service ride. The third video was someone wishing to get off a bus at the correct stop. And for that, we'll talk about the feedback and backup plans that were in place there. Next, we have somebody bringing laundry to a store and communicating with the clerk. And the last was street crossings. Before we go on about how we designed these cards and why, and looking at the research, I'd like to talk about 2 things briefly. One is about frustration. When tools do not work well, when they don't work quickly and they don't work consistently, then we have a problem that I've seen and my colleagues have seen with many deafblind travelers. That is, they think that people dislike them or don't want to help. The phrase, people where I live hate deafblind people, is something I heard more than a few times during my career. So we need these tools to work well, and we need deafblind people to have confidence that when they travel, they can achieve what they need to achieve and get what they need to get during those travels. A word about safety. Only the deafblind person, or in the case of children or people with intellectual disabilities, those who are their guardians, can make decisions about what's safe and what's not safe. I've heard many comments over the years, is it safe for a deafblind person to stand in a corner with a card that says they're deaf and blind? And I can't tell you yes or no, and we don't have reliable statistics on this. What I can say is that for 30 years, teaching deafblind people from around the country at the National Center, and teaching deafblind people who live and work in some of the most marginal neighborhoods in New York City, I've never had a single incident reported to me that somebody had a situation where it was dangerous or they were attacked or violated in any way. That doesn't mean things cannot happen, doesn't mean things haven't happened, but I would caution us not to take our own fears and assumptions about things and impart those onto our students. That's the experience I can share. So, speaking of the aspirations to travel, I just wanted to share a few historical notes here. One is from Laura Bridgman, who wrote in her private journal in 1853. Laura was probably the first very well-known deafblind person, a child at the time, who was world-renowned and preceded Helen Keller. And she wrote in her diary, "My legs would be so powerful to leap a great distance as well as the kangaroo. My arms could be of much agility. I wish so much to run of my own accord, as swiftly as my strength will allow me." And Helen, in her autobiography, one of them, wrote, "In sleep I almost never grope. In a crowded street I am self-sufficient, and I enjoy an independence quite far into my physical life. My soul dons its winged sandals." Those are quite eloquent expressions from two deafblind people who never had the opportunity to make the choice or to travel independently without being with another person or without being in a very restricted environment. I think it speaks to how important our work is when we talk about communicating with the public and traveling in the community for all of us, including people who are deafblind. So let's take a look at some of what we have achieved over the years through various research efforts. In 1989, there was the first study of street crossing cards, and in that study, only 7% of the people who passed by the deafblind person wanting assistance responded to that request. In subsequent studies in 1997 and 1998 and 1999, that rate of 7% gradually increased to 61%, with the various changes and changes to the tool and strategies that we use to catch assistance from the general public. In the last major study we have on street crossing cards, in particular in 2007, was my dissertation study, which was a regression study looking at many factors that are involved with deafblind people getting assistance with communication cards. The major finding, or one of them, was that 72% of assistance occurred with the very first person passing the pedestrian. That meant that 72% of the time, the first person to approach offered help. This is another indication of making progress in how we do things by manipulating the features of the tools. So let's take a look at this prototypical communication tool, the street crossing card, because that's where we have the most research. This is a recreated card, probably a little more formally presented here than it actually was, as described by a 1979 dissertation research thesis by Vince Mail, a mobility instructor at the Industrial Home for the Blind. And this card, as described by Vince, that was used very early on with deafblind people, says, "I am deaf and blind. Please help me to cross Main Street. Thank you." Notice a few things about this card. The largest emphasized words in caps and underlined are the person's vision and hearing status, deaf and blind, and it asks for help for a specific location, that is Main Street. This is what mobility specialists and rehab people working with deafblind people thought might be the best model for a card at the time. This is an actual card. I know the teacher and I knew the person who crossed the street with this. And you can see this is a card used at Helen Keller National Center back in the 1980s. And it's written on an index card. It says, "I am deaf and blind. Please help me to cross the street. Thank you." Note that there's no confirming response asked from the public. Every word is underlined in red, and it begins with the vision status, again, of the person who is deaf and blind. Here's another example. It's got many words on it. "I'm blind and hearing impaired. I need assistance to cross the street. Tap my shoulder. I'll hold your elbow." A card that was used in Georgia also during the 1980s and 1990s. So, that first card we looked at was used sometime between 1917 and the 1940s. The Industrial Home for the Blind, which had the very first pioneering programs that served deafblind people, had some clients who had to travel in order to work. And these were made on 3x5 index cards and asked for specific help. The 3x5 index card was thought to be convenient because it could fit in the breast pocket of a man's jacket. There were no women who were permitted to be educated in the rehab system for deafblind people at the time during those periods. The next piece of research that's relevant to what we are looking at is this card that says, "I am deaf and blind. Could you please help me cross the street? Thank you." This was used and proposed in a 1988 JVIB section, the Journal of Visual Impairment and Blindness, the Vision Journal of Record. And what the researchers commented on is that when they increased certain words, the words cross the street, they made it a larger font by 42%. Response from the public went down from an average of 22.6 seconds to something around 14 seconds in order to get help. This represented a real improvement in the amount of time deafblind people would have to wait. And note the change is that they changed the font of the information, the request across the street on the card. The next research that was published in 1993 was very interesting. My colleague, Donna Sauerberger, took a look at what was being used at the Helen Keller National Center, which is the card on the card on the left, and compared it to a card on the right. And what Donna did was propose to change the word order, moving the request for the street crossing to the top of the card, and moving the vision and hearing status down one level, and finally the response to be tapped at the bottom. But the most important thing that came out of Donna's research was the interview she did with people who passed by, and those that helped and those that did not offer assistance. 27% of the people didn't notice the traveler or the card at all. 80% of those who helped stated it was because they noticed the card. But interestingly, many of the people who actually helped only read the first line or two of the card. They never read down through all the different text on the card. 71% of those interviewed didn't notice or understand the traveler's needs. And the authors suggested that by moving the request for the cross street to the top of the card and moving down the vision status lower on the card, they could get an improved response from the general public. So those interviews were very critical in thinking forward about how to design a card. In 2000, researchers tested a card with an illustration. A colleague of mine, Suzanne Hogan, and I added an iconic picture of two stick figures, one doing a human guide with the other stick figure. The illustration increased the size of the card, and we think by the results indicated that the card was more comprehensible, quickly comprehensible to the general public. Moving on to the study that was published in 2008 based on the dissertation of 2007, we looked at combining all these different features into a card that was larger and easier to manipulate. What we did was we increased the size of the font and highlighted the request cross street. Proceeded next by the TAPME, the request, that is the response from the general public, and then last, the information about being deaf and blind. While the information that the traveler is deaf and blind is very important to the traveler and very important to us as instructors, people working with people who are deaf and blind, to the general public, it is tertiary information. It is not the kind of information that helps us initiate the transaction. That information may be valuable, or it may not be, because I've seen many street crossings where the person got the assistance they needed, but because of observing what was going on, you could tell that the person offering assistance never really realized the person was deaf and blind. And with the proper training, it's not an important issue. It's not what we need to convey, especially to prompt the person to get help. In that study, a larger card, one designed not on a 3x5 index card, but one on a card that was 4 inches by 8 inches, that had a lanyard attached, that was the card that got assistance quicker and with less people passing by. In fact, assistance time went down from 43-second wait on average to 28 seconds when we compared a standard card with a larger card. And the number of passers-by in this urban environment where the study was done, the number of people who passed by before assistance was gained, went down from 3.5 to only 2.5. Very quick, very consistent response from the public. So what were the factors that we put into this design? The factors were looking at font size, looking at the word order, adding iconic information, looking at the size of the overall tool, making it more obvious to the public, making it more visible. We looked at color and highlighting because eventually we decided we would highlight the words cross street. And we looked at the meaningfulness of this. Some of the studies in altruism show that the more meaningful a request is, that if the person's cane is displayed, if it's obvious to the person passing by that the person may need help, the more often people will help and the quicker people will help. There are two major things that we need to build into crossing cards. Those that need to be noticed, that is when people are self-selecting and passing by on a street corner, these things need to be noticed. And that means that they need to be obvious. White is a very good color for what's called attentional capture, when the vision cognition system notices something. And the size of an object is also a factor in gaining the attention of people involuntarily. The other thing that is that it needs to be understood. So when we're designing cards, we want to use clear illustrations, reduce clutter, create word order that people are more likely to comprehend, use increased font size when we need to and highlight that font. All those factors seem to be really important variables in increasing the improvement of the communication tool. So there we have it. We've gone through a lot of iterations of cards over the years, and through research and interviewing people and discussing this with deafblind people, we have found out that what we have now is a very effective and a very user-friendly tool. I'm just going through some of the iterations of cards that we have seen over the years. Finally, we come up with this card, which is the current standard used by the National Center and used by deafblind people all over the country. It always gives me a little thrill when I'm walking the streets of New York City and I see somebody who's deafblind at a corner using the card that came out of my dissertation study. So that's basically where we have things right now. It is important that we take this information and apply it to other kinds of communication tools. So in the next section, we'll start talking about other types of tools, other features of the strategies we use to make these tools as effective as possible. Thanks. If you're going to take a little break now and you can pause the video, you might want to do it now before we move on. So just to take a look at the tool that we were talking about, this is the standard street crossing card. It has a lanyard that goes over the neck. It has a handle so that the deafblind person can hold it securely without obscuring any of the text, and they know the correct orientation for the card, and the card can simply be dropped. Okay. So that research we looked at brings us to a number of what I and a couple of other practitioners in the field have called the principles of successful interaction with the public. And these are just a few key concepts that help you keep in mind how to design the tools effectively and how to teach this. So what you want to do is always assume that others do not understand the situation. It's very rare that people in the uninitiated public will have any thoughts about what they're encountering when they do pass or a deafblind person on the street, or meet them in a bank or a supermarket or some other public accommodation. They're not going to know what to do. And so we have to be explicit and clear and simple and very direct in what we want to happen. This is what will make the transaction work. The deafblind person themselves has to have a way to recognize that the communication is working or not working. And we'll talk about that in just a moment on the next slide. When we build into the strategy or into the tool a way for the deafblind person to know what's going on, we call it the fail-safe. And third, always have backup plans. And there's many ways, alternative ways to communicate or get attention, to be prepared when an attempt doesn't fail. So have a main approach to the communication transaction, and then have as many other ways for the deafblind person to succeed. Here's a number of different street crossing cards and communication cards that we've used over the years, and I just want to go through some of them to explain the fail-safe method. Classically, the bus ride card that you saw instructed the bus driver to hold this card until we get to Main Street. That does a couple of things. It not only informs the bus driver of what you want, because you want to get off the bus at Main Street, but it also lets you know if the bus driver has read and understood the card. Something like the fail-safe feature often goes after the request, so that we know the request has been understood. On the street crossing card, the fail-safe is the tap me. If the person taps the deafblind person, then we know that they've understood the card, or we have some reasonable degree of understanding there. Hold the card for a bus. We're going to talk about the track and ticket purchase in just a little bit. Sometimes in situations you might want a double tap or a triple tap so that somebody just bumping into the deafblind person is not misunderstood, as you can see in the 5th card here, the one that says, I need a guide to the next departing train for Washington. It says, tap my hand twice, a very specific fail-safe that says to the deafblind person, oh, I felt 2 taps, it's on my hand, I know that my request has been understood. Let's watch this video of a traveler who needed to get from one side of Penn Station, where they exited the subway, to the other side of Penn Station, where they're going to catch a commuter railroad. Penn Station is the busiest transportation hub in the United States, and the path that this deafblind person had to take did not have any clear shorelines in order to follow. So it was a very disorganized environment for a deafblind person, and getting from one end of this very large station to the other required that the person needed assistance. We put these principles together, and this video, which was a real video, and what you're going to see is assistance from basically the very first person that passed by. Let's take a look at this. Yeah, hold on. This deafblind person is passing through the beginning of the station where he still has a shoreline to follow. And when that shoreline disappears, he'll stop and he'll display his communication card. And you'll see that by the time I turn the camera back, the deafblind man has gotten assistance. The person reads the card. She thinks about it for a moment. And then she touches the deafblind person. Victor uses the proper technique, putting himself behind the guide, and they go on their way. These are the kind of transactions that we'd like to see with deafblind folks. Another common tool design that we use is called a forced choice design. And that design is one where you offer the person that is in a situation to help, in this case, somebody who is behind a window, and you give them a certain number of choices so that the response will always be helpful to the deafblind person. Notice in this that the fail-safe feature is that the paperclip will start in a neutral position, not on any of the possible answers to the deafblind person's request. That means if the deafblind person receives the card back and the paperclip has not been moved to an answer, the deafblind person knows that the card was not read and understood. They can then represent the card to the person that they're asking assistance or answers from. They can present it a third time if it fails. After that, they would go to one of the backup plans that they had previously rehearsed and created with their O&M instructor. So let's take a look at this. There's the card, and the paperclip would start somewhere neutral, like on the bottom left-hand side of the card. And we would probably on this card highlight and bold the words "move the paperclip." we see the deafblind person going through the doors of a railroad station and taking out his communication cards. The first task is rather routine. He's going to pass a note through the slot under the window to the railroad clerk. And notice the methods he's using. Not only does he give a note, but he emphasizes with a gesture that he wants one ticket. Now, this is something that the railroad clerk is used to doing. It's very routine. There's very little chance that there would be some kind of failure in this transaction. This is something that the clerk does all day long, sell tickets. The second request requires a more sophisticated communication, and that is the forced choice track number card. The deafblind person in this case has to know which of the 4 train platforms the next departing train will leave from. And the only way to do that for him is to ask the clerk. And as we saw earlier, there are choices for no track yet, which would mean the deafblind person would step away and then represent the card. And there's also the 4 track possibilities. And as you can see, there's the train and the track. Now, sometimes we have to make communication tools that request assistance from a distance. Imagine a deafblind person who needed to cross a street in a suburban or rural area to get to a bus stop, in a place where there were very few or no pedestrians at all on a regular basis. That deafblind person would still need to get across the street. And as you can see in this photograph, it is possible to get drivers to stop and help the deafblind person cross the street. We call these one, and again, they're worn with a lanyard, and will be held up in the direction of where the car would stop or pause. We did a study on this, and we found out that, amazingly, the numbers for gaining assistance for passing drivers was nearly the same. Between 2 and 3 drivers passed by before a deafblind person would get assistance across the street. Naturally, this is the kind of tool that would be used in a place at a crosswalk where a driver would be able to stop for a moment or pull the vehicle over so they could help. And this tool has been very successful in areas where deafblind people do not have a lot of sidewalk traffic, but do have street traffic and drivers going by. Let's take a look. You'll notice that this is the same tool I just showed you, and we're going to go out with the travel. And we're approaching an intersection here with the video at 5 streets meet. And as the video pans, you'll see there are absolutely no pedestrians in this very suburban area. Nearly everyone is in a car in this neighborhood. And this is the deafblind pedestrian. You'll see how he's standing, facing where the car would stop at the stop sign. And this video was made, this is the very first car that approached. The car stops. The driver gets out, and he assists the traveler to cross the street. These tools are generally made at 8.5 by 11, and as you can see, the font is very big. This is an example of the card we designed to, and when we tested it in Thailand, where in suburban Bangkok it worked very well. So, teaching these tools, there are some critical points to be made so that when you are teaching this before going out and while you're out, you should keep in mind. The student plans, and that's an important point, the student plans the necessary communication, including the backups for communication, organizing the notes and cards and equipment needed for each task. It's really critical that we brainstorm and design these tools with the student, keeping in mind what they're comfortable with, what they're able to do, and what they want to do. We want the student to organize them so they're easily usable. Cards can be put into a filing box or a large ring or a small notebook, or cards and notes should be unique in a way that they can be identified readily by the deafblind person. That might be a physical feature of the card, or it might be braille, or some other aspect of the card. One of the things I like to use is a classic pencil case that you can buy in a Michael's or a school supply store. This is a place where you can keep exact change for the public transportation, for example, and you can organize your tools and keep them easily, and if you would like, you can add a landing to this. During the experience, the instructor needs to be very aware of their placement and how they're going to interact or not interact with the student and the public. First thing is to observe unobtrusively. If you are anywhere near the transaction and look like you can help, there's something called a bystander effect, and usually that can dampen the response from the general public. If somebody's waiting to cross the street and you're standing close by, some people will pass by and not help with the thought that you would help. They don't know you're the instructor, so you don't want to be anywhere near the corner when that deafblind person is going through the trials and practicing this technique. Now, this means that the prerequisite skills that the deafblind person needs should already be in place. The deafblind person should be able to walk down the block, identify the corner, reliably, know where to stand at the curb or at the curb ramp so that they can get help readily where pedestrians are passing nearby. They need to be able to effect the Heinz brake. They want to display their cane in the case of getting assistance to cross the street. And all those skills you'd want a person to do until the point where they hold up the card. It's really important, especially in the early stages, that you refrain from intervening. You stopping and telling somebody in the general public what they should have done or what's going on, or not letting the deafblind person have the experience of the tool failing is not helpful. So it may be tempting to intervene or say to someone, oh, the person wanted help, did you read this or whatever. That's not going to be helpful in the training curriculum. You want to explain to the student that you're not going to intervene beforehand. You're going to tell the student that it's up to them when they want to give up, and that they make that decision. And also give the student a signal that means that it's time, they've given up and they'd like you to come over and assist. That could be something like raising that cane in the air or taking a communication card and raising it up. But some way for you to know this trial is over and the deafblind person would like to discuss what's happened. Things don't always go well. And when they don't, that's a learning experience. Be sure that the person understands what should happen so they can learn from what doesn't. Let's take a look at one example of things not going very well. This is a deafblind traveler who's learning how to get assistance to cross the street. You'll notice that he's used his cane and he's arrived at the curb, but the curb he's standing at is blocked by a car. You might also note that the deafblind person is smoking a cigarette, maybe something you wouldn't want to do. He holds out the card and he waits for assistance, and this woman comes over and she takes the back of his arm. The deafblind traveler does not do a Heinz brake and does not put the hearing sighted person in front of him. So the person assisting takes him into the street and basically pushes him into neutral territory. At this point, the deafblind person is screaming out, "Don't leave me, please don't leave me, I'm deaf and blind." And finally, they get to the curb and she sort of pushes him up onto the sidewalk. There are many things that are wrong with this transaction. The obvious stuff is that the deafblind person didn't have the prerequisite skills. They didn't assure that they were in control by taking the back of the person's arm. We have other examples of that, but for the sake of time, we're going to move on. After the experience, you want to be sure that you give the deafblind person objective feedback about what you observed. The instructor and the student can brainstorm about the interaction. They should have a discussion. They can come up with ideas or alternatives, new backups or new fail-safes that go into the tool so that they constantly move towards successful transactions. Just a few more thoughts before we end up this topic. It's been my experience and the experience of some other people that general cards that simply ask for help do not work. So a communication card for a person to say, please help me, tap me if you can help, I'm deaf and blind. Those kind of cards do not seem to engender making things happen. The person might read the card, they might misunderstand what the person wants, they don't know what they're being asked to engage in. And so I've had very poor results whenever we try to build a tool that will do that. It's always good to start with, again, what the research showed us. What is it the deafblind person wants? I know it might sound trite, it might sound facile to say that we ought to build in experiences and skills for dealing with the uninitiated public as early as possible with deafblind people. So that should mean that as early as the deafblind person can start making and requesting things from people they don't know, they should be using some kind of tools that give them a choice and get them and give them communication with the uninitiated public. I did a small study at a school for the deaf that I worked at for many, many years. And I looked at several dozen students, and I looked at the correlations between ability to travel and interact with the public and the other kinds of experiences. One of the things I can tell you is that what did not correlate in any significant way to the success of the deafblind person travel was their standard IQ tests that the schools do. The intelligence scales and their academic achievement didn't necessarily mean that they were going to be better travelers. What I did find was a correlation between the deafblind person, the deafblind child in this case, or youth, and their interactions and their communication with their family. How often their family took them out on trips and engaged them in what was going on, instead of just pulling that deafblind person along to be with them and not really communicating what was happening. So in my opinion and in my experience, success in this area is related to experience, and those are experiences that can be built into an O&M curriculum, into transactions in the educational system, and into interactions that the deafblind person can have along with their family. And I think those are the important things that we have to think about and incorporate. This is not a standard area in orientational mobility or necessarily the education that deafblind children receive. But it needs to be attended to because it so much relates to success in life. I can tell you, I've had so many young adults and even older adults come to do training at the National Center of Deafblind Person who had almost no successful experience with the uninitiated public. And that's due to a lack on our part, not their part. Finally, I just want to leave you with my email address. Please feel free to contact me at any time by email through my MSN address. I'm always happy to assist or help or brainstorm, and so please feel free to do that. A final comment, my colleague Donna Sauerberger, who's always been a pioneer in this area of orientational mobility, I want to thank her. Some of the materials we looked at today were hers, and her publications, including her first book on this matter, were historic and invaluable. Thank you for attending this session. I hope you got something out of it. I know it was a little wonky, a little dry at points, but I want to wish you happy travels, happy teaching, and leave you with the thought that deafblind people can do and will, with your assistance, travel independently in the community after they've had the proper tools and training. Thanks a lot.
The CEU code for this session is AS111. AS111.